Okay, Daniel 7, we find that Daniel says in verse 1, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. And then he wrote them down, and he gives the main facts of them. And so Daniel says in verse 2, he saw in his vision by night, and behold, 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So he's given a vision here, which then has import because, as we find out or have found out later on, he's told by the angel when he asks the interpretation of this, that these 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms. They are 4 kings, 4 kingdoms, and the end of these 4 kingdoms and their existence is that the holy ones of God receive the kingdom. So again, we have something similar going on here in Daniel chapter 7 as we do in Daniel chapter 2. And as we mentioned last week, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, and then 9 and on out are building on elements that we find in each one of those. And in each one of those, there's a focus that is given that narrows down more and more. So in Daniel chapter 2, you have the big scope of human history, the image and its 4 parts representing the 4 kingdoms, with the 5th kingdom being the kingdom of God being established, and that kingdom of God described as surviving forever. It takes over all the others, and it rules forever and ever. Well, in Daniel 7, you have the same similarity. You have 4 beasts, then there's a 5th kingdom that is described, the kingdom that is given to the saints. It's the kingdom that is given to the Son of Man. It's the kingdom of God, and it's a kingdom that reigns forever and ever. However, there's some unique focuses that are given to us in Daniel chapter 7 about the 4th kingdom. It expands some more information about the 4th kingdom that we see in Daniel chapter 2. So when we get down to that, Lord willing, sometime, we'll be able to see that. And then when you get into Daniel chapter 8, you have just a glimpse of a portion of history that is the Medo-Persian Empire, the 3rd beast that we look at tonight. And so, the 2nd beast, rather. And so, Daniel chapter 8 will expand for us on a little bit of that information that we're given here in Daniel chapter 7, which also expands on what we're given in Daniel chapter 2 about the silver part of the image, which is the Medo-Persian Empire. And again, with the description that's given here, they're described as beasts that have the characteristics or are like a known animal. And so the first one is a lion with eagle's wings. And by the way, with eagle's wings, that's where we find some people in prophecy saying, "See, there's the United States," because it's an eagle. And the symbol of the United States is an eagle. So that's what this is talking about. However, the problem is that it's pretty clear that Daniel understood this wasn't the United States. And that according to history, as you run with the flow of how these prophecies are laid out in the 4 kingdoms, that there is a logical progression that starts with the Babylonian Empire. And we know that because Daniel says in Daniel chapter 2, "You, O king, are the golden head." And so everything about these kingdoms and empires is flowing out of Daniel's time frame of the Babylonian Empire. And then from world history pans out. Okay, so with the description of them being actual animals here, a lion with eagle's wings, we're given a clue as to the characteristic of these kingdoms. And so last week then we looked at several things in Scripture that show us that when you have the characteristic of a lion and the eagle's wing, you've got a kingdom here that is essentially described by that which is the dominant ruling animal. The lion, the king of the jungle. The eagle is considered king of the prey, praying birds. And so not preying birds, but birds that are eating on animals, preys, hunting birds. Anyway, you know. And so with that characteristic of using animal characteristics here to describe the nature of these kingdoms, then we also get a clue as to what they are like. So let's look tonight at the second beast that is described here, and that is in verse 5 of chapter 7. Daniel says, "And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear, it was raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth, between its teeth, and they said thus to it, 'Arise, devour much flesh.'" Okay, now one of the things that we see about these descriptions of the beasts is not only the characteristic that you find of the animal being characteristic of the kingdom, but there's also something about the kingdom that is unique from the other kingdoms. Okay, so in verse 4, the thing that was unique about the Babylonian kingdom is that it's described as being, in the middle of the verse, "And it, the lion with eagle's wings, was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it." So here the characteristic of the kingdom is that you have a beast that is made into a man, or the transition from beast to man. And that's unique about this kingdom because there is no other kingdom that we have a description of in which the king reigning loses his authority to reign and goes insane for a time period. His kingdom remains, and when he gains his sanity, he resumes as king. And the only one that we know about in history, and according to biblical record here, is Nebuchadnezzar. And so again, the defining thing about the kingdom here that is unique from the others is you had a king that went insane, became an animal, and grew hair like the feathers of an eagle, and then regained his sanity when he acknowledged God. Well, we'll see in each one of these, there's that similar thing. There's something unique about each of these kingdoms. So here we've got a bear. And the bear is described as one who is raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth. Now, why would he have 3 ribs in his mouth? Guess what he's just done doing? What a bear loves to do: eat. And when a bear eats, or put it this way, when a bear is hungry, that is when they are fiercest. And they are known to be fierce when hungry and very, what's the word? Well, like an animal when they eat. And so you have the description here of a bear with the ribs in its mouth, describing the fact that here it has gone after fulfilling its hunger, but it's done so in a manner that is very, well, it's very fierce. So keep that in mind as we look at this. All right, so what do we see about this bear? First of all, we see the greater strength of one. The greater strength of one. As is similar to the golden image, you had the 2 arms of silver and the chest of silver. So you had a kingdom that is divided into 2. But here it is expanded out a little bit more, and it's revealed that here you have a beast that is raised up on one side. And the picture that is given by the Hebrew here describes vividly an animal that is, as it is getting ready to rise up from reposing, it is still leaning on one side, and the other side has already extended out its legs in order to stand up. And it's important to understand this picture because what it describes for us is that you have the appearance of an animal that is arising from having been resting. It is now getting ready to do something, but it is in the act of doing something that it is known to be fierce in doing. That is when it gets ready to eat, when it's hungry. And the suggestion that we have here is that Daniel is seeing, as he was told, a king and a kingdom. So you have an empire that is getting ready to arise. It's going to be fierce in satisfying its hunger for building its empire, but also because it is raised up on one side, it seems to signify that there is greater strength on one side of this animal than on the other. Keep that in mind. The second thing that we see here, it is significant that it says that it had 3 ribs in its mouth, between its teeth. And so the idea here is that it has been eating, and it has eaten these 3 things, or these that were part of something. So you have 3 things of something that have been consumed by the bear when it appears to Daniel. And the appearance of these kingdoms is the idea that one comes into existence and then it is overtaken by the next one. And so Daniel is understanding here with this beast that here you have a beast that arises, and it is comprised of an empire that is made up of 2. One is stronger than the other, but it has kind of been resting for a while. Now it's arising to stretch out its empire, satisfy its hunger for dominance. It's going to be fierce, but when it takes over as the next kingdom, it has done so by consuming 3 others. So if you look back in history, it is interesting to note. We do know that the second kingdom that comes up is the Medo-Persian Empire. And that's because in Daniel chapter 5, if you remember the end of the chapter, Daniel mentions that Babylon fell, and that very night, the Medes and the Persians took over the city. And then in Daniel chapter 6, you have the rule of the Persian Empire. And so Daniel identifies the second kingdom in this by eyewitness, that it's the Medo-Persian Empire. Now here's what's interesting about the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire originally was called the Medo-Persian Empire for a reason, because it was a combination of the Medes and the Persians. The Medes were the first to come to the game. They are a group of people, a nation that was north of what today is known as Iran. They were to the north of that, and they were a group of people that had dominance. So much so that they actually were dominating over the Persians to the south. But then there arose a king, Cyrus the Great. He said, I've had enough of the Medes dominating us. And so a part of the Greek Empire. And Lydia was conquered by Cyrus the Great. He did this in order to expand the Persian Empire. He went after those in Lydia. Now, this is important because there is a conflict that arises between the Greek Empire and Persia that is sustained for a number of years until the Persians are overrun by the Greeks. But this was part of the original squabble. It goes back even farther than this. But by 550 BC, Cyrus had conquered the Medes. It had become the Medo-Persian Empire. They had conquered Lydia, a major portion of the Greek Empire. So you have 2 bones already taken care of. What do you think would be the third? What other world empire is standing in the way of the Medes and the Persians being the big bad kings? Babylon, isn't it? And Babylon is that third one. Because in 538 BC, 539, Cyrus's armies overtook Babylon, and it fell. And then it was later, around 520-ish BC, early 500 BC, around in that time frame, that Egypt then was conquered by the Persians. And they went on this rampage where within the scope of their, at the peak of the Persian Empire, You had the Persian Empire extending all the way from over in Greece down towards Egypt, all the way over east towards the Indias, the western side of India. It was an empire that stretched almost 3,000 miles and ruled over 44% of the world's population at that time. Now notice what the Bible says here about this beast. It says in verse 5 that he had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. So by the time it conquers Babylon and takes over as the ruler, it has conquered these other 2 nations, Babylon being the third. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. And then what is the characteristic of it that is different from all the others? Well, what does it say? Into verse 5. And they said thus to it, arise and devour much flesh. Arise and devour much flesh. So what you find with the Persian Empire is an expansion here of a greater rule of man, a greater rule over man. You know, the Babylonians did a pretty good job. But the fact of the matter is that the Persian Empire was greater in extent than the Babylonian Empire. In fact, we find that over the course of their 200-year reign, they had an expansive network of road systems, of a postal system, of governance, which we find Daniel talking about. Remember the funny term that the king Darius had 120 provinces, which are called satrapies, P-I-E-S, and the governor is a satrap. This is documented in Persian history that's how they divided up their governance. And these individual governors then were usually ones who would be loyal to the king, but they were like little kings reigning over the nations that were conquered by Persia. So guess what? You had a Yehudian, and it was that part of Israel during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah that had an administrative governance from Persia. It was one of those satrapies of the Persian Empire. What the Persians did was they just integrated the nationalities into their empire, but did not force them to change and become Persians. So as a result of this, they had an extensive, a huge empire. And within this empire, there was something called the Royal Road. It was much like, you probably, now I'm drawing a blank on it. Oh well, so much for that illusion. But anyway, the Royal Road was 1,600 miles long. And it was said that a horseman could go from one end of it to the other 1,600 miles within a week. It was much like and help me out here if you remember this. In the American West, back in the early 1800s, there was a method of moving mail via horseback. Pony Express. All right, the Pony Express guys were known to be hard riders. I mean, they'd come barreling into a stage station and they would jump off of their horse, jump onto another horse, and then take off running. The horse would. They're on it. And then they get to another stage station about 20, 30 miles down the road, switch horses, and they're off and running again. And these guys, in order to deliver the mail, kept riding and riding and riding, and they were able within a week to go from one side of the country to the other, or at least halfway. It was possible. That's a similar thing that we see happening here in Persia. So because of this extensive network and the administrative abilities of it, this Persian Empire was characterized by the fact that it had devoured much flesh. But when Daniel is told about their appearance, it's described as a bear, fierce in hunger, hungry to satisfy its desire to build its empire, and it starts out by conquering Media, Lydia, and Babylon. Okay, one other note that we find from the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 8, run over there. And in Daniel chapter 8, we have an expansion again about this third kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire. But at this time, the imagery is not a bear, it's a goat, a male goat. And if you look at verses 3 and 4, verse 3 and 4 talks about the ram. It's a ram that depicts this empire, and then there's a male goat that is referenced a little bit later here. So in verse 3 it says, "Then I lifted up my eyes and saw there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns." Now listen to the next phrase. "And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last." Okay, now what do we have expansion given to us about this kingdom that is going to be described for us? Is that the bigger horn is a result of the other part of the kingdom coming up later. So remember, what did we say about the Medo-Persian Empire? Who was part of it first? The Medes. And then who conquered them in 550 BC? Cyrus the Great of the Persians. So that's the picture that you have being laid out here. Now, verse 4, it says, "I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward, so that no animal could withstand him." Guess what the Persian Empire did? That very thing. It expanded westward. How far west? India. It expanded northward. That includes Lydia. It expanded southward, which would be towards Israel, Egypt, Africa, northern parts of Africa. So the description that is given here is of this very similar thing that we see of the third beast. Now, lest we say, well, we're drawing conclusions here that are not really biblically based, look down at verse 20. So verse 20, Daniel is given the explanation of who this ram is. And you look at verse 20 of chapter 8, and he says, "The ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of" what? Media and Persia. So in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20, we're told that what Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 8 is regarding the Medo-Persian Empire. And the description of that empire is of a ram with 2 horns, one being bigger than the other, and that bigger one having come up at a later time. Again, similarities with Daniel chapter 7 and the second beast, the bear, being bigger on one side and having conquered 3 nations. Okay, so we can with confidence say that the empire that is described here in Daniel chapter 7 as the second beast is the Medo-Persian Empire. All right, the third beast. Hey, we got past the second one. All right, let's look at the third beast, Daniel chapter 7, and look at verse 6. In verse 6, he says, and after this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. All right, again, we have a unique description about an animal, and the animal here is a leopard. What do we know about leopards that are true? They're fast, aren't they? They're not quite as fast as the fastest critter on earth, which would be the cheetah, but they are fast. Leopards are very fast. They are intense because once they get going, they are locked in on where they are headed. I don't think I've ever seen a video of a leopard that has decided to take off after something, but as he's running, he's looking around going, wow, this guy is cool. Look at that tree. Did you see that? He's not distracted at all. Rather, his eyes are focused on where he is going and the prey that he is going after. And there's an intensity to overtake it. And because of their speed, they're very successful in being able to overtake their prey. And many times it's done with a sudden attack. And an attack that once it begins and then ends, the prey is wondering, what hit me? And that's the picture that is being painted with the leopard here. It's increased by the fact that it is described as having 4 wings. All right, if you got 2 wings and you're able to fly, that's considered pretty good. But if you got more than 2, then the natural thinking is that, well, if you can fly so fast with 2, you can fly how fast with 2 more? Twice as fast. And so the picture that's painted here is not only of a swift animal, but with 4 wings as well. It increases this sense and this notion of one that is very, very quick, fast, speed. So speed and intensity are meant to describe this kingdom by the leopard. All right, so what do we find out about this? First of all, the speed of conquest. It describes the speed of conquest. With this third kingdom, as we look at the historical record, the kingdom that superseded the Medo-Persian Empire was which one? Remember from history? It was the Greeks. Now remember, part of this is driven by the fact that the Greeks and the Persians had this centuries-old feud. They were constantly battling each other back and forth, trying to conquer one or the other. And the latest battle that had happened with the Greeks, the Persians had basically cleaned their clock. So the Greeks are itching for revenge. And Philip of Macedonia, Philip II of Macedonia, began to get back at the Persians. But he died before he fully succeeded. And his son took his spot. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. When he died in 323 BC, he had conquered all of the Persian Empire. How long did it take him to do it? Less than 13 years. That was pretty quick. So you have the speed of the conquest described here. Secondly, you have the split of the kingdom. The split of the kingdom. Look at the description of the animal here. He's a leopard. He's got 4 wings on his back. And then the latter part of verse 6 says, the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. It's described as being a 4-headed beast. So the original description of the kingdom describes the Greeks coming in, but you also have a description here of something happening with this kingdom that makes it be divided up into 4 heads. Now, the significance of 4 heads describes the fact that you have 4 authorities. You've got 4 kings. You've got 4 that are part of this original that are now ruling. What do we find happened after Alexander the Great died? Well, apparently he died without naming a successor. And so there was civil war that broke out, and the eventual outcome of the kingdom of Alexander was that it was broken up into 4 sections. You have the Seleucid kingdom, and that extended from Israel to India. And those descendants came out of the individual named Seleucid. And then you had the Ptolemaic kingdom down in Egypt. This was centered in Alexandria. And out of Alexandria and the Ptolemaic line, you had Cleopatra and all those famous individuals. Okay, so that was the Ptolemaic line. And it essentially became the Egyptian pharaohs that were ruling after this time frame. That's northeast Egypt. Then in Asia Minor, you had the Lysimachus. That's a big term. How would you like that for your kid's name? Hey, what's your son's name? Lysimachus. Hey, kid, what's your name? Lysimachus. That's a tongueful, isn't it? Mouthful. But the Lysimachus dynasty was the third person involved in all of this, and basically over Asia Minor. So Turkey, Lydia, that area. And then the last kingdom that split off of this was a remnant of Alexander's descendants, and they ruled in Macedonia and Greece. So when you go across the Mediterranean there and you see Greece, that section of what's there and a little bit to the north, that's where Alexander's descendants ruled. So that's how the Greek Empire was broken up into these 4 divisions. We know that from history. And history proves it out. Well, that's what Daniel is seeing here with this third kingdom. So there's a unique characteristic that really does put this within the time frame of the Greek kingdom being this third beast, the leopard. And then, let's see, you also find a specific legacy here. What's the specific legacy that was given to this third beast, the leopard? It says the beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Dominion was given to it. So the significance of this one is that it has a kingdom that is readily given to it. It's not necessarily a kingdom that is built up, but rather it's the notion that there's a kingdom and an empire that is already existing, but it is given to this empire, the Greek Empire. And what do we find about the Greek Empire? Is that the Greek Empire really has a lasting legacy. They not only ruled over what was the Persian Empire, but the things that the Greeks came up with live still today. You know, some of the ways we do our ruling and our government is based upon what the Greeks came up with. Greek thought has impacted the world since then. So you have this specific legacy here of dominion being given to it. And then lastly, note here that with the Greek Empire, we also have confirmation in Daniel chapter 8 that this is the Greek Empire that's being referred to. All right, so Daniel chapter 8, again, remember, Daniel's given a vision. His vision relates to the third and fourth kingdoms. Only this time, instead of being a bear and a leopard, it is a ram and a male goat. We've already seen the ram in Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. Look at verses 5 and 8. 5 through 8. Daniel says, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, broke his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to withstand him. But he cast him down to the ground, trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he came strong, the large horn was broken, and in its place, notice, 4 notable ones came up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, when you look at the Greek empires, it was broken up. Guess what the points of compass are? North, south, east, and west. So the same description here is given of the same thing, only it's a different critter. Here it's a male goat, and he ends up with 4 horns after his conquest. All right, so with those similarities then, is this Greece that Daniel is being told about? Well, go over to verse 21. And guess what Daniel is told? This is incredible, because this is All right, 550, yeah, it's 530, it's 550 some BC. And Daniel is told this in verse 21. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. So Daniel's told specifically this is Greece. Now, at this point in Daniel's history, this is a couple of hundred years before this event happens. And yet God accurately tells Daniel, this is what is going to be. This is who the kingdom is. Why? Because prophecy is God revealing it to us what he knows the future is, how it's going to pan out. So with that piece of information, when we plug it in backwards, we find out that the ram, or the male goat described in verses 5 through 8 with the 4 horns is Greece, then the leopard with 4 heads, being a kingdom that arises as Medo-Persia, must be whom? Greece as well. Okay, so the 4th kingdom. But we're not going to go into it, because the 4th kingdom is pretty extensive. And there is a lot within this one. The reason is that the 4th kingdom is expanded for us here in Daniel chapter 7 out of Daniel chapter 2, and it is expanded for us some more later on as well. If you remember that what God does in prophecy, you get a glimpse, then he gives another glimpse with more information about the previous glimpse, and then he increases that information as we go down. And that's what we'll find happening here with these kingdoms. So the next time we're together, sorry guys, we'll look at Daniel chapter 7 and the 4th kingdom here of the 4th beast, the 4th kingdom, as Daniel has seen it. And we'll see what God teaches us about this 4th kingdom. All right, now let me lay just a little bit of groundwork, because we got a couple minutes here on the 4th kingdom that is relevant for today. Okay, one of the things that we see about this 4th kingdom is that the one who comes to dominate the 4th kingdom does so based upon fear. Playing upon and developing his kingdom based upon the fact that people are fearful. And in order for this 4th kingdom to be able to arise in the future, there has to be the working in society and culture of people being motivated by fear, willing to accept anything as a solution to that fear. In other words, surrendering their sovereignty, surrendering their self-determination, surrendering who they are as a people and the freedoms they have in order for fear to be allayed. And really up to this point in history, as far as the world population goes, there has not been yet a willingness on the part of people just to surrender who they are and what they have because of fear to an answer that is given to them until now. And we have seen over the course of this last year with COVID and all the stuff that's been coming out of it, the willingness of people to surrender to an answer, their freedoms, their nationality, their sovereignty, in order to have a solution to this fear of something that is unknown. And this kind of thing has to increase. Because in order for this 4th kingdom to be able to succeed, it is built up on fear, and you just can't suddenly take over several billion people who have the practice of their own nationality or sovereignty and defending it, and suddenly rule over them unless there's been a pattern already set. And that's one of the things that is unique about what's been going on as we've seen this over the course of the year, that it's giving us some basis here to understand that what God says about the future, yeah, it will happen as he says, because we already see the groundwork being laid for it to come to pass. Well, as we will look at the fourth kingdom, we'll find there is more and more of what is described in the future beginning to bubble right now and to show forth. So I want to encourage your heart to realize that as you see these things happening, not to despair. God said they would happen. And they will happen because he said this is how it's going to end up. But remember that, like Daniel learned, God wins. His kingdom is the one that comes out on top. He is the victor at the very end. And for us, the victory right now is that the worst that could happen to us, think about this, the worst that could happen to us, that the worst that mankind could do to us right now, is to take our life in some manner, deprive us of our life in some way, or lose our life according to some plague. But what do we get? It's heaven. And that can't be taken away. That can't be removed from us. That is ours. And so if the worst that could happen to us is the worst of what could happen, the best out of it is that the better is still to come. And we can look forward to that. So God always does win. And he will win.